the reason I'm here today is Ed Ricketts and his relationship to John Steinbeck. He was 5 years older than John. He had a business even in the Depression. He had a car, he had a phone, he had a washing machine, he had an Encyclopedia Britannica. This was really something. And his lab became the gathering point for a group of intellectuals, thinkers, writers, artists, poets, bohemians. The original Ed Ricketts lab group that we think of John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts being part of actually started in Carmel. Francis Whitaker, the Carmel blacksmith, forged in the forest, actually built a little cottage for Jack Calvin, who was Ed Ricketts' co-author in Between Pacific Tides, which made Ed Ricketts almost world famous in 1939. But his wife had this little cottage built as her art studio, and it was the gathering point for a group of thinkers, this little group that kind of orbited around Ed Ricketts and his friends. Well, in 1932, Jack and Sasha Calvin moved to Sitka, Alaska, and it endangered the little clubhouse that the group had had. In that time, Ed Ricketts had moved his business from Pacific Grove, where he started it next to Holman's in 1923. He ended it there in 1929 when the building was sold and demolished. He found a new place to move Pacific Biological Laboratories, and that was to Ocean View Avenue. And in 1932, when the Calvins left, that became the new meeting place for everybody, including John Steinbeck. To say that Ed Ricketts was an unusual character is an enormous understatement. I'm still trying to find ways of expressing, after about 1,000 interviews, and many, many, many of them with the people who not only heard about him, but actually my passion was to reach the people in the time I had that actually knew him. The one thing I can say is I've never heard a bad word said about Ed Ricketts in all of my research, and I would be lying if I said otherwise. That in itself sounds a little bit unbelievable, but it gives credence to the reverence that John Steinbeck had for him in his fiction. John Steinbeck met Ed Ricketts in this little bungalow in Carmel in 1930, and so began what I insist is the greatest symbiosis of science and literature in the American experience. No two guys in our American experience have done so much together as Steinbeck and Ricketts. And had the world known what Ed Ricketts was really all about, he was killed by the Del Monte Express after an accident on Cannery Row at Drake and Wave Street when he was struck by the evening Del Monte Express train on May 8th, 1948. His old beat-up 1938 Buick stalled, and he tried too long to start it before he tried getting out, and he tried getting out of the driver's door and basically got pinned between the door and the post. If he'd stayed in the car, the photos of the accident show he probably would have survived, but that wasn't the plan for Ed Ricketts. And in a really somber sort of way, nobody was prepared for a guy who could feel the tides change. To get hit by a steam engine on Cannery Row when he knew every day when it came through? Well, it's taken a great deal of research, but part of the reason the Cannery Row Foundation was founded back in 1983, and that's our mission today, we are still at it, is to separate Ed Ricketts, the scientist, from Ed Ricketts, the character in John Steinbeck's fiction. And John is a great fiction writer, I think the best. But he didn't ever really let you know what a brilliant man Ed Ricketts was, although he tried to credit Ed on various occasions. But Ed Ricketts, had he not been hit by that train, and he and John Steinbeck had gone up and finished their work, Ed Ricketts had already started in the Queen Charlottes up in British Columbia. Within about a year, 18 months after that trip, he would have finished the trilogy. We refer to it in his study area, the trilogy. He had already done Baja California as part of the Sea of Cortez. He had already done the entire the California coast in Between Pacific Tides, and he was about to finish the work on the Queen Charlottes. That would have been the trilogy, and his name would have been a household word, household scientific word around the world, because it would have completed the most detailed marine biological assessment and research of the entire west coast of North America. That still has not been accomplished today, even by universities and combinations of federal organizations. And he nearly accomplished it on his own, without a grant, without any sponsorship. He did it for the love of what he was doing. And that passion hopefully rubs off. It had on me. It keeps me going, and I'm looking for those kind of people who do catch fire when they find out what kind of a person Ed Ricketts is. And I can attest that there is a generation, actually several generations now, of modern marine biologists who were propelled into their fields by Ed Ricketts, by the revolutionary effect that he had on his science. Because when he started out in 1923, after coming from Chicago without a degree and set up shop in Monterey collecting specimens, Hopkins Marine Station was not pleased with him. They considered him a poacher, even though the cats and the mice and the frogs that you may have cut apart and followed in your high school and college biology classes had to be provided by somebody. That was Ed Ricketts' business at Pacific Biological. But he was not, there was a very, very strenuous effort to keep his publication of Between Pacific Tides from ever happening. In fact, John Steinbeck was able to help that happen, and in 1939, Ed Ricketts and John Steinbeck were both major authors together. John Steinbeck for Grapes of Wrath, and Ed Ricketts for Between Pacific Tides. And you cannot become a marine biologist today without studying Between Pacific Tides. Now that's really something. Ed Ricketts basically stood marine biology on its head. He said, you need to know that a species is so many centimeters long, a certain gram weight, and it behaves this way and that way, a certain color. That's what the whole science was doing, including Hopkins Marine Station at the time. What he was trying to explain as an observer of the tide pools, he never went scuba diving, never went below the waves. He's looking at tide pools up and down our coast and assessing and studying and appreciating why under certain conditions, groups of animals actually live together cooperatively, committing murder and mass mayhem, reproduction, all of this stuff going on within certain relationships. We didn't even have a word for it at the time. We do now. It's called ecology. It's the interrelationship between living animals and various different conditions. And that was the theme upon which Julie Packard led the creation of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which opened its doors in 1984, heralding a basic and really revolutionary approach to marine biology, led in very large part and totally unheralded by Ed Ricketts in a shabby little building on Cannery Row. It's sandwiched between a couple of sardine factories back then. Right now it's scrunched between the aquarium and the Intercontinental Hotel. Jackson Benson, professor of English from San Diego State, in 1984 had a very interesting question from a lady in the audience. And she asked, well, as John Steinbeck's official biographer, what do you consider his most important works? And he didn't hesitate at all. He said, Of Mice and Men, Grapes of Wrath, and Cannery Row. It's magical. It's about ordinary people. He is not being a historian. But Cannery Row, according to Scrap Lundy, who did 11 years of biographical research, of which I did a very small bit of help with him, we've come to the conclusions that about 90% of Cannery Row, the book, is real. John did not write fiction. In fact, he uses real names and real people occasionally throughout the book. So when you read Cannery Row and hit the street, you're going to be able to, if you're invest in a little bit of interested research, you're going to be able to know where the Palace Flophouse really was, because there was one. You'll know that Calisa's was the La Ida Cafe, where Eddie, the part-time bartender, poured all the leftover drinks from the night's business into the same jug under the bar for Mac and the boys back at the Palace Flophouse. That the things that John Steinbeck writes about in this great book, set about 1937, although he wrote it in 1945 after being a war correspondent. This is Cannery Row 1937. It is glorious stuff. And even the movie Cannery Row, although it was very difficult to do that and make a combination of both Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday, David Ward did do a couple of really great things. First, great sets. The set designer for that admitted to Frank Wright, one of the lab members, that he had never seen Ed Ricketts' lab before he designed the sets in that movie. But I can attest to you, Ed Ricketts would have lusted for the lab that was in the movie. If you've seen the MGM 1982 and you've seen the little wooden box on Cannery Row that passed for Ed Ricketts' lab, you'd understand why that would be so. And secondly, I think that one of the best short sequences in modern American film is the narrator, John Huston, with that gravelly voice, reading John Steinbeck verbatim about the frog hunt in Carmel Valley. That's out where I live now. But that is an absolute experience worth buying or worth getting Netflix to shoot you that particular movie. That is one of the most hilarious scenes in modern American film.